Hey, welcome back to the Teske Brief. I'm your host, Steven Teske, retired judge. You know, for nearly a year, I've ended many of these episodes with the same thought, okay? Political power is temporary. Bar card is forever. Your bar license to practice law. At the time, some people probably thought I was speaking metaphorically, but I wasn't, okay? I was speaking professionally. Because lawyers understand something politicians often forget. Administrations come and go. Election victories come and go. Cabinet appointments come and go. Professional accountability, on the other hand, well, it has a much longer memory. It waits quietly, patiently, sometimes for years. And then one day, it arrives. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that day's arrived. For months, we've explored what I called the bar card. Now, I know you thought we were over the bar card series. Something just recently happened. But let me go on. Not because I was interested in politics, not because I was interested in the profession. We examine what happens when lawyers are asked to choose between professional judgment and personal loyalty. We talked about in the bar card series, remember the prosecutor's dilemma? How about the episode, The Loyalty Test, or Target First, Crime Later? And what about the episode titled, What a Real Prosecution Looks Like? Hey, if you haven't seen them, go back, take a look. Each episode asks essentially the same question. What happens when lawyers stop asking what the law requires and begin asking what powerful people want? Powerful people like the President of the United States. Now, we have our first real answer. Just days ago, a bipartisan coalition of 101 former state and federal judges, 101, filed a comprehensive ethics grievance with the Attorney Grievance Committee of the New York Supreme Court, requesting a formal investigation into acting Attorney General Todd Blanche. Think about that. 101 judges, not 101 Dalmatians, 101 judges. That's not an angry editorial, folks. That's not a cable news panel. That's not social media. That's practically maybe about 10 appellate courts. When one judge questions your conduct, that's concerning. When 101 judges sign the same complaint, you stop calling your political consultant, folks, and you start calling your ethics lawyer. How about your malpractice insurance carrier? Now, before we go any further, let's remember something that's important. Grievance is not a finding of misconduct. It is the beginning of a disciplinary process. The allegations must be examined, the evidence evaluated. Mr. Blanche is entitled to respond. That's exactly how due process works. And as lawyers, we should insist upon it. Because due process is not something we defend only for people we agree with. We defend it for everyone, even those we disagree with, like Todd Blanche. But I have to say, folks, I wasn't anticipating it coming this soon. You remember probably in the final episode or two, I made reference that this was going to happen to Todd Blanche. That I even went so far as to predict that he probably would be disbarred. Matter of fact, I think I said he would be disbarred. But there will be a complaint. I just wasn't thinking it was going to happen this soon, but it has. Now, Pam Bondi, on the other hand, they filed one back in June of 2025, but the Florida Bar has a certain rule that says something to the effect that they will not pursue the investigation if that person happens to be in a politically appointed position. I think one, maybe a federal stature, maybe confirmed by the Senate. I'm not really sure. You can look that up. But when Pam Bondi was fired by President Trump, you remember what I said? Within about a couple days, over 100, lawyers and former judges, including 2 Supreme Court justices on the Florida Supreme Court bench, that's where Pam Bondi is barred, filed the complaint. And guess what? I just looked it up, and it's active. And now, instead of declining it, it's now in the investigative stage. It's an active investigation. The former Attorney General. Now, we need to remember that here's what makes this filing extraordinary. That is against Todd Blanche. Not the politics. It's the people. These are former judges, Republicans, Democrats. I mean, you probably wouldn't know because, as judges, we're not supposed to disclose expressly whether Republican or Democrat. You could probably tell maybe by some comments that we might make here and there. Obviously, now that I'm retired and I can express myself, freely, okay, as long as I let you know that I'm a retired judge, all right, you could probably guess I'm not exactly real conservative. I have conservative values, all right, I have conservative beliefs, but I do tend to lean more moderate, maybe a little bit to the left. It depends on the issue, right? But these were career jurists, people who spent decades deciding cases rather than campaigning against them or about them. They placed their names and reputations, folks, behind a document arguing that serious questions exist concerning the professional conduct of the nation's chief law enforcement officer, Todd Blanche. Now, folks, that deserves our attention. Come on. The grievance identifies 4 major categories of alleged ethical misconduct. As I read them, I couldn't help but realize something. It's this. We've already talked about every one of them in my episodes. No, not because we knew this grievance was coming. Well, that's not really true. I knew the grievance was coming. I just didn't know the timeliness of it would come this soon. But it was because the ethical principles were always there. First, the alleged conflict of interest involving the IRS settlement. Remember? The one that I claimed Trump versus Trump. I mean, in actuality, it was Trump versus IRS, but it turned out to be Trump versus Trump. Now, if you follow this series, you'll remember our discussion of that episode, Trump versus Trump. The constitutional problem wasn't simply who won. It was whether the lawsuit remained genuinely adversarial once the president controlled the executive branch responsible for defending it. Now, the grievance raises a related but distinct professional ethics question, and it's this. Whether Mr. Blanche's role after serving as President Trump's private attorney and then as acting attorney general created conflicts under New York's rules of professional conduct. Now, notice something. That's not a political question, right? That's simply an ethics question among us in the legal profession. Lawyers ask those every day. And second, the grievance alleges retaliatory prosecutions. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it should, if you've been watching my series. We devoted an entire episode to what a real prosecution looks like. Remember the lesson? Real prosecutors begin with evidence, not with the person, which is what's been going on, not with a headline, not with a political objective, not with, hey, my boss, or who I perceive as my boss, the President of the United States, doesn't like James Comey, so I'm going to go after him. I don't care what it's for, but I know he doesn't like him, so I'm just going to go after him. But real cases, real true prosecutors, ethical prosecutors, they begin with the facts. Then they decide whether prosecution is justified, not in the name, not in the person, not in the personality, not who your boss thinks is an enemy. The Department of Justice isn't supposed to become a sword for the president. It's supposed to be the sword for the people of the United States. The grievance argues that this sequence was reversed in several matters. Whether that allegation is ultimately sustained is for the disciplinary process to determine, right? As I said before. But the ethical principle itself is one every prosecutor should already know. And third, the complaint raises allegations involving cryptocurrency policy and financial conflicts, which, interesting enough, is now coming up at this moment in the news regarding President Trump and the billions that he's made on cryptocurrency, though many of those who invested in it have lost. Wow. But it's about something much older, and that's public duty versus private interest. You see, the legal profession has wrestled with that question for generations, because the public must never wonder whether a government lawyer acted for the country or for himself. And you would think the same would be true for the President of the United States. Fourth, the grievance addresses Blanche's handling of matters involving the release of the Jeffrey Epstein-related files. Again, whether every allegation proves true will be determined through the disciplinary process. But notice the common thread. Every allegation returns to exactly the same question. Did a lawyer fulfill his professional obligations or allow something else to take priority? Okay. You know, lawyers have an old joke, okay? And it's this. Never become the case that's assigned in professional responsibility class, or otherwise known in my old days as the ethics class. It's funny, because it's true. None of us lawyers want to become the example future lawyers study when learning what not to do. Reading this grievance, I felt something I honestly didn't expect. Not satisfaction. Quite frankly, I'm going to tell you with sadness. Because I've spent my career believing the Department of Justice represented the very best of our profession. Were mistakes made? Of course. Every institution makes mistakes. But there was a culture. Career lawyers challenged each other. Senior attorneys asked hard questions. Ethics advisors had influence. The room wasn't silent. There was a lot of talking, a lot of questioning. I can't tell you how many times that the lawyers in my office where I work today were in each other's office saying, hey, what do you think about this? What would you do? Am I pursuing this correctly? Help me out here. People said, many people said, in the old Department of Justice, before the days of Donald Trump, I don't think we should. Sometimes they stopped bad ideas before they ever reached the courtroom. Folks, that's professionalism. Throughout this series, I've said repeatedly, the resignations were never the story. They were the warning. This grievance doesn't prove that prediction, but it certainly illustrates why so many experienced lawyers chose to leave rather than remain silent. Now, I want to be very careful here. No lawyer should celebrate another lawyer becoming the subject of disciplinary proceedings. That's not who we are. A bar complaint is not a trophy. It's a tragedy because somewhere along the way, something has gone terribly wrong. But here's what gives me hope, okay, folks? The legal profession still possesses one extraordinary safeguard: the independent bar associations. They don't answer to the president. They don't answer to Congress. They don't answer to cable news. They answer to professional ethics. Their client is the integrity of the legal profession itself. Look, folks, I wrote and published an essay on my Substack account, Justice Redesign, back in, I think, maybe October, called The Bar Card. Way back then, I predicted that the one thing that is going to safeguard this country in terms of what this administration is doing and violating many aspects of the Constitution is going to be the legal profession. It's going to be the judges, the judiciary, and lawyers. Now, I'm not talking about those lawyers who, for some reason, I don't know what happened to them. They fell off the edge and they decided for some reason that they would follow and represent Trump and filed all these petitions back in 2020 in courts alleging election fraud, but they had no evidence and they end up admitting they had no evidence. And for those of out there who are still election fraud deniers, folks, you cannot overcome that fact because those lawyers have been disciplined and some disbarred by these independent bar associations. You could talk about it all you want, but there never was evidence. You just happen to believe in a personality, a person named Trump. And you know what? You let that personality run your life without asking critical questions. You believe almost everything he says, including the 2020 election fraud. But you go into a courtroom where you have to have competent evidence and the rules of evidence. And these lawyers actually have to get up there and admit that, well, they don't have any evidence. And that's what they said. And many of you complain. Well, they never went to trial. That's not fair. Well, they didn't go to trial because in trial procedures, you have to show that you have some evidence before you can go to trial. Otherwise, you're going to get a motion to dismiss. You know, and that's another problem in this country is our civics. I mean, what happened? We got rid of civics. In my day, I went to high school. We had government classes and civics classes. We got rid of those so long ago. And so many people don't even understand how things are supposed to work in a true democratic system. And now what do we have? One moving toward an authoritarian, toward closer to a dictatorship. Oh, okay. I'm going to get off my high horse here, but point is whether this grievance ultimately results in discipline, folks, I can't predict, nor should anyone else. That process deserves respect. But one thing has already changed. The question we've been asking throughout this entire Bar Card series is no longer hypothetical. The profession itself is now asking it. One day, every president leaves office, including Trump. Every attorney general leaves office. Every administration becomes history. But every lawyer eventually returns to exactly the same place, and it's called the bar, and not the one that you sit at and you drink. Because that's where our profession keeps its memory. That's where politics ends and professional accountability begins. The wheels of justice, folks, I admit, they do indeed grind slowly. But sometimes they finally arrive exactly where they were always headed. All right, Steve Teske, retired judge. Thank you for joining me. And remember, your greatest professional asset, it isn't your resume. It's your title. It isn't your client. It isn't your political influence. It's your name. And if you're a lawyer, it's printed on a little piece of plastic called a bar card. Protect it. Anyway, until the next episode, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening and take care. Bye.